Welcome, everyone, to the third episode of the Usual Places podcast. My name is Jordan, also known as Scotch. Today, we're going to be having a very special guest on the episode. We're thrilled to welcome Marco Micheletti. He was the supply chain program manager at Xbox back in the day, and we're thrilled to kind of pick his brain and hear about his stories back there working on the Xbox. So we'll get into that. First off, I just want to introduce ourselves. So, like I said, I'm Scotch. We also got a couple other people on the call here who will be jumping in occasionally. We got Haguero.
Hey everyone, how's it going?
And then we also got a couple of speakers. Just wanted to announce them real quick. So you might hear from, for example, Harcroft might speak a little bit later.
Hello.
We also got Skye, our hard drive data analyst expert. Hey, Skye, how you doing?
I am tired. It is 10:30 here, and I had coffee, and it was not enough.
Well, I think the lethal dose for caffeine is pretty high up there. At least I hope it is, because I'm on my third Red Bull for the night. So anyways, just a couple quick topics before we get into the kind of meat of the episode. So last episode, we talked about the Bootrom exploit for the Xbox One that was recently teased, I should say. It wasn't necessarily announced, but it seems there are two projects going on simultaneously that are rather interesting. One of them seems to be more of a hardware-based method that gets into the console and apparently might even get code execution early on, which is very interesting. Like we were saying last episode, these consoles are about 11 years old now, so it'd be very cool to see second life go into those. And how often do you pull out your Xbox from 2013? Might be good for Netflix, but hopefully that could be opened up to do some other stuff. I know we've been talking to some folks behind the scenes to try and hopefully get people to come on and tell us more about that. Separately, though, there's also a second piece of news in the modern console space, and that's that the Xbox One and Series, so basically the Xbox OS, at least the modern version of it, there's been proof of concepts for gaining access into the different levels of the operating system there. So, like I said, it's all rather new. It's all bleeding edge. Nothing's been released too much. There's been proofs of concepts released, but piece of news, though, relating to that is that Microsoft did pull down the GameScript app from their online store. So if you didn't get that in time, you're kind of out of luck. So for anyone who has that, just as a reminder, put your console in the way, unplug it, set it aside, and maybe some good news will come from that. Other than that, a couple other things I wanted to touch on just before we move on. So there is some new cool updates coming out for PrometheOS. For anyone who's not familiar, PrometheOS is a operating system that loads on your Xbox before the console boots and loads the kernel and the BIOS and all that. It kind of runs as an alternative and has a bunch of utilities, one of them being hard drive unlocking, which is an awesome feature that is great for preservation's sake. So it works on a variety of different mod chips. I don't necessarily want to talk too much about that because we've also covered that in previous episodes. But point being is there's some cool updates coming out for PrometheOS as well as SirBIOS. So a lot of things that are quality of life improvements, a lot of things that fix video and compatibility issues. So hopefully we'll see things be a bit more stable for different console revisions and different video mode outputs and such like that. So cool things are coming out in that arena. Other than that, there is some piece of news I wanted to have Skye share with us. I know she's been hard at work, just digging in and tearing into those old Xbox hard drives, just trying to recover content and push that whole topic forward. So what have you been up to lately, Skye? I know you've had some recent successes with working on some of those Western Digital drives, right?
That is right. Unfortunately, work's been keeping me pretty busy lately, but recently I'd been working with Eaton trying to get support added for the OEM drives into Fat Explorer. After some extensive testing, we'd gotten that finally seemingly under wraps, and there is a release out. However, there had been a particular nut that it was kind of hard to crack. So the OEM drives, the old ones, they use their own sets of vendor commands that were not well known, but they were kind of tucked away. And one or two tools online for Linux had the commands in order to get the module 42, which had the password stuck there, basically. We figured out how to get it out and figured out how to make that work in Windows. But we wanted to try and actually add support for any newer drives that people had in their Xboxes from, say, soft modding. So, say, for instance, somebody has a soft modded Xbox or even a hard modded Xbox that had some hard drive upgrade taken place at some point in time. Say maybe they put in a 320 gig, which was a weird size that they had for a while, 500. And for some whatever reason, maybe it was fully locked, or maybe the master password had been forgotten. Well, we were trying to actually add support for dumping the passwords on newer drives because they use a completely different command set since they use a completely different firmware architecture. And after some testing, I was actually able to get the commands for that, and we're going to be trying to get that implemented here shortly.
Wow, so it's kind of going beyond the original Xbox drives. So this could be useful to just general people who might be locked out of a drive that was made 10, 15 years ago and just happens to be compatible with this tool, right? Is there any plans or efforts that you guys are talking about making? I mean, obviously it's the goal is to include it into Fat Explorer and all that. Are these tools useful outside of this scope, or is that even something you guys are concerned about or thinking about yet?
Well, originally I was trying to just make it to where it was more hospitable for Xbox users, basically. But this actually, by pure coincidence, ends up being rather useful for pretty much anybody who has an ATA-locked Western Digital hard drive. And the new commands that we have now, they'll work on basically any Western Digital hard drive from about 2000, I want to say it's about 2008 to about 2018. So even somewhat modern drives, these new commands will actually work on. So this will make it to where you can dump the user password and master password on even somewhat recent Western Digital hard drives, and it works for ones that weren't locked with an Xbox as well.
So with this recent stuff with the Western Digital, so forgive me if I'm a little out of the loop on that. So this allows different revisions of Western Digital drives to become unlocked, right? Or is this still kind of improving the process and just adding it to Fat Explorer?
It's, if I'm understanding what you said correctly, it's both. We have support for the original OEM drives, and we're expanding that support outwards. So it will work with more than just the stock drives that come with the Xbox. We're expanding it to where basically any Western Digital hard drive from about 2004 up until about 2018 will be able to be unlocked and have the user password and master password be dumped and accessible. And this will be useful for really anybody, even outside of the Xbox scene.
Right. It's kind of funny that kind of spawned out of this, talk about original Xbox. And I'm sure someone 1,000 miles away, maybe several years from now, is going to stumble across the progress you've done and recover some old family photos that's on some locked drive or something like that. You never know the repercussions of your work, right?
That is kind of my hope, actually. It's this is for the Xbox, but also at the same time, if word does eventually get out about this, then if you've got a password protected hard drive, it doesn't matter. You can just download this piece of Xbox software and gain access again.
Right. That's pretty cool.
Hey, Skye, just a quick one. In regards to the vendor unlocking, is there any chance that it will work on any other drive, like Seagates, for example?
The Seagates are unfortunately tougher nut to crack with newer ones. There are vendor commands for those that will process commands over ATA. I currently do not have a method to extract those.
Okay.
That is going to have to be a future project.
No problem. I guess it's going to be a paperweight. I've got a 8 terabyte that I accidentally locked and then destroyed the Xbox, so I can't recover the key.
If you want, send me a message or something, and when I get into work next week, I'll see if maybe I can figure something out.
No problem. Thank you.
So kind of switching gears a little bit, something else that's going on and new in the scene is, as you guys know, Harcroft has been hard at work working on the OXHD project, which is a open source direct digital HDMI board for the original Xbox. He's been working on this for months and months at this point, been pouring countless hours into it. Seems like you've made some good progress on improving the compatibility with some of those other revisions of consoles, right, Harcroft?
Yeah, so OXHD actually just started streaming some gameplay. I got it working. I had just I had pushed the flex cable a little too far down, and it wasn't making good contact. 1.0, 1.1s aren't working very well, and I know it's our flex cable. I've put in for revisions to get new ones ordered. They've been ordered. It's just a matter of waiting now for new flex cables, and then if we have a problem there, we just keep trying until we get it working. So the reason we're having inconsistent results is essentially there's traces on the bottom of the flex that were used to help add some capacitance to the lines. That seems like a good idea in theory, but I think we're getting signal reflections, which is just garbling It's just essentially destroying the data on the Pixel bus, not just for the HDMI, but for the console. Not so much of a problem on the 1.2s, 3s, and 4s, but I've already rectified those extra traces, and hopefully the next flex will work on 1.0s and 1.1s as well. It's very slow going because every time we get a new flex or a new board, we have to test it thoroughly among multiple consoles. And if those consoles work, yay. If they don't, we have to go back to the drawing board and try new things, So the board, I think, is functionally complete. The biggest issue now is getting our own flex cables without copying anybody else's, completely making our own. That we can give away the Gerber for, so you can buy, or if someone does a bulk order, they can sell them at a reasonable price or whatever. Because you don't want to buy an order of 6 or 10 flex cables for yourself for one cable. You want 1 or 2, right? Anyway, Things are looking up. It's just it's very slow going.
Well, it's very cool. I'm excited and looking forward to actually throwing one of those in my box. All right, so moving into our next topic, we welcome a special guest onto the usual places. We're thrilled to have Marco Micheletti on. Marco was the supply chain program manager for Xbox back in the early 2000s, and he was instrumental in overseeing some of the plastics manufacturing and the parts that went into the Xbox. He's been kind enough to share some of his stories here and there in forums and in threads and with specific members of the community and stuff like that. So we're very thrilled to have you come on, Marco. I appreciate you taking the time. Just wanted to welcome you. Thank you so much for hopping on with us tonight, Marco.
No, thank you. Yeah, you're right. We had lots of different titles back in the day. We tried to push the boundaries on whatever we could get away with on our business cards. But, there was a really small team. I joined right after CES in 2001 when they did the official announcement of the Xbox. I joined about February, and it was a whirlwind. But there was 3 of us in the actually 4 of us in the supply chain team. One person, one of our directors, managing all the manufacturing. My boss, who did all the high value components, hard drives, optical drive, CPU, GPU. Another gentleman who did everything that was basically the rest of the silicon. And if you've all looked inside an Xbox, and kind of everything else that was important was me. And so that included the case, the cosmetics, everything on the outside going into the motherboard, to fans and heat sinks and cables and connectors and a bunch of other stuff. So that was my the 3 or 4 of us essentially responsible for manufacturing and supply chain, kind of for Xbox Round 1.
And you guys were making hundreds of thousands of those units a week, right?
Yeah, it was a race to get, for whatever reason, because 1 million sounds great. There were obviously partners, all the retail partners that, the launch was always slated for the fall, for the holiday season, and there was definitely technical difficulties on the march to mass manufacturing, and that squeezes your timeline. But, like Christmas doesn't change and things like that. So we went out the box with a factory in Guadalajara, Mexico with Flextronics, and, that was targeted for the North America launch. And the goal was to get as many as possible into the market. But when you get crunched on time, the goal that we were really ended up shooting for and achieving was something close to about 1 million units for that first holiday in North America, which is always just like, what's the best you can do in the shortest amount of time possible. And that ramp up is usually, a challenge and really hard to do. But when we were, let's say, cruising at getting the supply chain, I guess, and manufacturing running, trying to think exactly how the split went, but we were hitting upwards of 300,000 a week between our 2 factories in Guadalajara and then Western Hungary. Once both those facilities were up and running, let's say in year 2 or 3, it was roughly, I want to say, like 100 to 120,000 a week out of Europe, and 180 to 200,000 a week out of Mexico, and then eventually we brought up China and shut the other 2 down. But that was the run rate. Definitely midlife was about 300,000 a week that we were getting up to.
So did you work at Microsoft prior to you being sort of in the Xbox department? Were you already present there?
No, yeah, I was definitely younger person than I am now. It was, let's say, call it my second real job out of college. My first real job was I was literally a rocket scientist in a local company in Redmond. We made rocket engines and satellite propulsion systems. And I came out of school as an engineer, and I was doing some engineering in propulsion system, thermodynamics, and thermal management systems, and propulsion tanks, valves, some of these commodity items. And I started gravitating towards some of the contract and supply chain aspects of it. And the people I worked with were really great mentors and encouraged me to continue going that way. So I did. And it ended up being, if folks remember, like 1998, 1999, if you're in the tech industry, everybody in the world was starting a .com, and it was the .com boom. And so people left and right were leaving Microsoft, and they were getting cleaned out because everyone's starting .com. So they had a big recruiting push to replenish the ranks. And actually, at the time, my sister worked there, and she said, "Hey, I get like $800 or $1,000 if I just turn in a resume." They were looking to recruit.
Wow.
Yeah, it was nuts. So I did my resume, and I was like, I wasn't really kind of looking to change because I was like fresh out of college engineer. I was building
Yeah.
rockets and stuff and doing really cool stuff. And I didn't know kind of like what my career trajectory was going to look like at the time. And I was like, why would I leave what I'm doing right now? I really just didn't know any better, didn't have any desire to leave. And then they literally just called me and said, "Hey, we have this kind of like secret project. I think you'd be a really good fit. Are you interesting to talk?" And I was just like, sure, on a whim. And I went in and talked to them, and I could kind of figure out what it was. There were rumors at the time. This is in the fall of like 2000. And I had a few conversations. I interviewed, I think, like first week of 2000. They had CES, so I knew eventually kind of what it was during that process. And I was kind of hired at the end of January, and I started early February. And we had a really typical kind of like, Microsoft has its boot camp or whatever, your initiation day, and you go in, you do like training for a day or two, and or 3 or 4 days or whatever it was at the time. And you'd come back into the team and you sit down, and normally we'd just say, get your passport, get a 24-hour passport and a China visa expedited. You're going to like China this weekend. And that was kind of initiation for a lot of people on the team. And that's pretty much how it went for me. And the first thing I did after my first week there was spent a week in Taiwan and a week in China, after like I never thought in my life that I go to those places. It was crazy.
So that was your first week working at Microsoft, like at all?
Yeah, like I started on
to-
Monday, and they basically said, "Is your passport up to date?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, back then you could get like a 24-hour like expedited visa, and they're like, "You're leaving on Sunday," more or less.
Wow. Jeez.
Yeah.
That would have given me whiplash. Good Lord.
It was. I probably didn't know any better, but it was kind of also like what we did. It was almost just how that worked with almost every new person on the team. It almost always ended up like that.
Yeah. It's just like keep up or get out at that point.
Yeah, and that was for sure. And I didn't really know kind of the role that I was taking on, but the team was growing, and the gentleman's role that I was backfilling was the person who I still know, and actually he kind of still works with me. He ended up being the program manager for the controllers, and he was handing off all the console related stuff so he could focus on the controller program, and I took over for him because he was doing, I think, probably both at the time. So he took me and just said, "Here's all the state of play for all the components that we're working on." And it was mostly, we were looking to source the manufacturing launch partner for the motherboard in Taiwan mostly. And we were visiting a number of folks, but that was the main people we went and saw the first week in Taiwan. And the second week in China was Foxlink, which I don't know if folks how familiar are with certain contract manufacturers, but they were the big supplier for all of the custom connectors for the controllers, and eventually connectors and actually more controllers in future revisions, but among a number of other commodity parts we were working on, but those were the main folks that I was working on and meeting in China those first trips.
It sounds like you were a part of a pretty compact team then. You said there were just 4 of you kind of overseeing all the different manufacturing processes for the parts and all the shells and all the cases and all that, right?
Yeah, well, that was me, but there was 4 of us for kind of everything that was a purchase part, that we bought.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I don't know how widely, I don't think these aren't secrets, but the original team, when they seeded the hardware team, not necessarily the grader team, they took a gentleman named Todd Holmdahl and there was another guy, some other folks, but they all came out of PC hardware, and they kind of took, it might not be fair to say the 10 best, and they were 10 very, very good hardware operators from PC hardware, and they kind of seeded, and that was the original design and engineering team that led Xbox, and that was mostly design focused at that point in time. I can tell you, like, when I was there, the hardware team was about 25 people, and I don't think we had more than 35 people when we launched. And that includes probably like 4 or 5 electrical designers that were obviously responsible for the actual architecture of the system. We had some planners and quality people and dev managers and the controller team, but that was it was pretty lean and mean.
Yeah. So would you say, coming from your first career out of college, working in propulsion, I mean, obviously you have to have a deep understanding of material sciences and thresholds and breaking points and tolerances and such like that. So I imagine a lot of that stuff, even though it sounds completely unrelated, I imagine, did the mindset at least of that help with when you went to produce things and test them and all that? Like, do you feel there was overlap between the two at all, or was it mostly separate?
Yeah, you know what? I would say yes, but in a different way. My kind of funny story about college and engineering was that I was kind of a bad student. I don't think I was a bad person. I just didn't really know how to learn engineering and engage in learning. And I didn't learn in a book. I learned by doing. And so when I took all my finals and barely, let's say, got out of college barely with a degree, I sold all my books, and then I went into pretty deep fundamental engineering, material science, all this stuff, and I literally bought all my books back. But when I was doing and applying all these things, all this engineering came back rushing, like it just made sense all of a sudden. And so what happened, and if you kind of think about, this was kind of my analogy, it was like I got to make, like, let's say 100 rocket engines a year that no one ever got to see, and then I quickly moved to making 1 million Xboxes that everybody in the world got to see. The scale
Right.
scale is different, which means like the depth of what you can go to is also different. And so I learned a lot of high volume manufacturing processes. We had things that failed and broke, and you had to get to the root cause really quick. But having that like good engineering fundamentals and really understanding how they applied to like things like stickers or plastics or it was really similar, but in a different way. And it was really exciting too, because you got to utilize it in a different way every day.
One question I did have, so just talking about putting these plastics through their paces and stress testing them. So what sort of tests did you guys run on it? I mean, like, for example, modern smartphones, they put them on shake tables, they spray them with water and stuff like that. Like, did you guys have sort of something similar for that you ran?
There
these
is,
plastics
but
through
I
their
would say
paces?
like compliance and testing was another person. And I think that some of that preliminary testing had happened prior to me joining, because I think we would have had our first set of tools, and they would have done a lot of those. So, like the dev kits and things like that, those were already in existence, and those were all made off our first set of prototype tools. And so what you would typically do, I'm fairly certain this would have been the case, is you do a lot of drop testing, and you do potentially put them on shake tables, but for the most part, for consumer products, you do like 10-sided drops where you're dropping on like every flat surface of the device from like a tabletop
Right.
or kind of wherever you want your spec to be. And this is like a really heavy thing. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of inertia and mass and things that can break. And so I think a lot of that had already gotten figured out. It's also like, you've taken these apart and you see the screw bosses that join the top and the bottom, and the cases being either, ABS or PC ABS are like pretty robust, and ABS for the black boxes are somewhat forgiving. It's actually like rubbery in a sense. And so has a lot of compliance. You can drop them. You can do that. You can get stress marks if they deflect a little. But for the most part, I think a lot of that was settled well before I got there.
Mm-hmm. One thing from our first episode that we were talking about is like these things are like rock solid. Like one of the reasons why we're all kind of hanging out and talking about this console is because it has stood the test of time. One of the things we said specifically was you could probably drop this thing off of a roof and it would survive. It's remarkable how well designed it was, I guess. It didn't get any changes over the course of its lifespan. Like newer consoles would get slim revisions and they would get different processors, more memory, and that's more common nowadays.
Yeah.
Back in the day, it was probably quite uncertain whether or not this thing would actually take off and people would respond to it. Was that part of the conversation in your guys' heads? Like, how do we make this thing as rock solid as possible? How do you guys draw the line between over-engineering something and not?
Yeah, I think there was, let's say, a conservative attitude. I honestly, I wasn't there in the early design, so I couldn't really tell you, but I can tell you, I think there was a conservative aspect of it needs to be solid, and how they did that and brought that into the design process. I think it's a little bit of, until you do that and build that body of knowledge, as you can see in future iterations, then you can understand what good enough is, or where you can take material out or lighten it up or do different things. But I think the point of what you were saying, which is like, we just didn't know where it would go, was really more of the case than anything else. I would tell you that the other point of emphasis that was more prominent than anything else was because of how solid it was. And it was solid to hold all the pieces, but there was a lot of pieces in there, right? When you consider a 3.5-inch drive and a large drive and an optical drive and all that being built in and packed in as close as you can, it was a tank.
Right.
And the thought process was more around, it needs to be hefty. You could drop it, but they were really scared about it really falling on and hurting somebody. And it was really
it's 8 pounds. And did the original Xbox start the whole breakaway cable thing? Walking across the living room, kick the controller cord, and it just disconnects as opposed to ripping the console down. I know I lost a PS2 once that, or damaged a PS2 once that way.
Yeah, I mean, we paid extra, right, to go put those quick disconnects in there because the console, like, I can just tell you that they wouldn't have done it otherwise because they were so afraid of it sitting on a shelf, getting the cord tripped, and it hurting somebody. That was a very, very serious consideration. And just going back with like the design, like they put everything in there they thought that they needed, and it was overbuilt or overspec'd a little bit for the future because they didn't know how fast how long it would hang out and how long console update revision cycles kind of wasn't, it was a thing for other ones out there, but like how they would react to, like, say, Sony or Sega or anybody else at Nintendo at the time, that wasn't kind of as much of a thing. Like they just didn't know like when our opportunity was. It was really more so like, let's get out into the market. And the hard drive was there. They thought that was going to be a differentiator from the game developer standpoint. And the big thing was the broadband jack, and the fact that 5%, less than 5% of homes had broadband before it launched, but by the time that generation was over, like penetration was pretty huge. And it seemed like that was kind of one of the risks that paid off. It wasn't, let's say, as costly or as space taking as like a hard drive, but that seemed to be, there were a lot of trade-offs in the architecture that, some of them were worthwhile and some others were less worthwhile.
Back in 2001, it was obviously a completely different landscape to what we have today. And yeah, that was pretty revolutionary back in the day.
And I think that the decision for that, whether it's well known or not, it was like literally goes all the way up to Bill Gates, like being fairly insistent on this is a direction of the future. And the say the engineering design team may have made a different decision, but it was a really high level decision to say no, we see a direction that technology is going, and that's a worthwhile spend to put it in for the future.
Hey, Marco, it's Hag here. Just a question. Did you have any input on the design? So, I mean, if you saw something that you thought might be a crucial flaw, could you point that out? Or was that design already finalized and done?
No, the industrial design for sure was already finalized, and that even goes back, I would say, further before tooling. I did also work and learn a lot with the industrial designer who worked with others that worked out the shape and the form and the factor. But no, that I would. I think maybe those photos, the photos that are out there with me with the when we're either looking at different colors or with the orange and maroon consoles. The one of the gentlemen in there is the industrial designer. I managed that supply chain partner, but like I could tell him I like that color, I don't, and he could tell me and he could school me all day long on the history and the consumer marketplace reaction to different tints and colors and things like that. And these things were way above my pay grade for sure. There might have been, let's say, a lot of form factor testing maybe on controllers, and maybe we built a few different types, but I would say that the feedback from the people on the team was less important than however they went out and got market or other feedback on it from other type of testers.
So for the most part, it was the design was there. It was more so up to you to contact the plants and have the molds made and things like that, which I can't imagine how expensive those things must have been.
Yeah.
So yeah, and those were injection mold, right?
Yeah, again, I worked more with the mechanical engineer, and he definitely like, the process for developing like a tool for a product, especially at Microsoft, a lot of the detailed engineering is outsourced. So the person I worked with was more of a outsourced engineering manager, and he maybe didn't exactly design it, but he ensured that a team of folks were designing it. So when we start talking about how many ribs for rigidity on the inside, and then what are the bosses like inside, and what kind of texture are we going to use on the outside, and how does that get translated into a tool that we can manufacture, that's a very deep process in itself. And so by the time I got there, the tools were mostly in production. And they were what we called Cadillacs, and there's a lot of things you do once you go to qualify a set of tools. So from a cost standpoint, just for reference, I want to say roughly like a bottom case tool was about $200,000, and a top case tool was about $300,000, and we had roughly 8 or 9 of each of those. And then we had all the other parts, the fronts, the buttons, the little things like that. So like probably a set of tools was probably about $700,000-$800,000, and that's just for the enclosure, right? The plastic parts. And we had roughly 8 or 9 of those, in Mexico. We had about 6 or 7 of those in Hungary, and eventually we remade them all for China. And again, things like textures, you want the texture to like for every console off of every tool to always be the same, and we test and check and make sure that the textures weren't wearing out, and those tools were just so well made, they never wore down. By the end of the life, almost every one of those tools had over millions of shots on them, and they looked as good as they did on some of their first shots, and they're really amazing tools. Unfortunately, when we shut down Mexico, we were going to decommission the tools. And if you ever saw the inside of one of the top case tools, it just was the coolest thing, because the part that's smooth is just really high polished, and then it's in contrast to the X that's got that texture, and it's got all kinds of other things if you ever seen inside a plastic tool. And these things are like the size of like a sofa, like half a sofa or so. They're pretty big. And we were going to try to bring one up and use it and make a coffee table in the lobby of a building.
That'd be cool.
And so I asked normally what you do is you decommission the tool, you destroy it. You tell them and you make them like weld an arc across the middle of it so they can't make parts anymore. And it's like really sad.
Yeah.
We were going to try to bring one up, and I was talking to our general manager, and he was on a teeter-totter. He was like, how much will it cost for us to bring it up here on a truck? And I was like, $2,000 or something. And he was like, he almost said yes. It would have been so awesome to have an open tool, and you just drop a piece of glass on top of it. It will look so cool.
That would have been a very expensive coffee table for sure. So obviously you guys, there's a variety of factories and a variety of parts that you guys produced and made sure were within spec and all that. Were there any particular pieces that gave you the most problems? Like, say, for example, did the top of the case, one of those legs was always breaking off? Was there like a recurring problem that just haunted you for a while, or was it all, for the most part, pretty smooth because they had rocket scientists working on it,
The plastic parts, once they're qualified, I can't think of any issues that we really ever had with those.
Okay.
The metal, the Faraday cage on the inside was tough for us to build both actually in Mexico to get it up and running. Like just the holes, the punches just would break a lot until they really figured out how to run the tool and get enough spare parts and things like that. For sure, I think I discussed the bane of my existence was the jewel on the top. That gave an inordinate amount of trouble compared to anything else mechanical. The launch process was completely gated by the GPU. We had to have NVIDIA like refab inner metal layers. That was probably the main thing that delayed launch from kind of June to about September. And for whatever reasons, the interplay between hard drives, optical drives, and GPUs, there was like a really secret, not a secret, there was like a secret that none of us really knew why or how certain combinations would only work with other combinations. And it's kind of a reason why like we mostly only used, I think, Seagate drives at launch, and then we would mix in a few WDs, but then we had to switch back to consume other like versions of silicon that would only work with Seagates, and it was really back and forth. And it was like, maybe like the read access times wouldn't work right or something with the other ones. And it was just like stuff that we didn't have time to figure out. And clearly outside of my scope, but it was like, those were some of the biggest odd challenges in early configuration management of building, but those were real problems. And then there were like the perceived problems of dirt specks on the green jewel on the top.
Yeah, and speaking of the jewel, so what was that whole process like?
Going back to what I was saying, like, there were real engineers doing real work to figure out the motherboard and getting the NVIDIA GPUs all figured out. For whatever reasons, well, let's say for industrial design and look and feel and branding reasons, which tend to be decisions made at higher levels, at some point between CES and before we launched, there was that Wired magazine that showed Michael Marks, the president at the time of Flextronics, holding an Xbox, and it had that metal jewel, which was one of the candidate jewels and processes, which it was a metal stamped kind of a foil looking jewel. But we hadn't decided on which jewel to make, and there are cost considerations and things like that. And so fast forward, we ended up with the jewel that you saw.
That stamped jewel is actually something that we were curious about. Was that just sort of like a stopgap, as in it was never planned on being the official jewel? That was just something to kind of fill the space while you guys figured out the real jewel, or was that going to be the jewel at some point?
There was probably 2 or 3 other types or variations thereof between metal and the molded dome one. We even were thinking about things like, how do you get like EL paper underneath it and try to backlight and illuminate it? And there was a lot of things about trying to figure out like, what could we do to make it really like a glowing special thing? And, that's how these conversations start. But there was probably 3 or 4 different prototypes, like variations on the metal, variations on the ones we saw. And I think it was really came down to like a compromise between what probably felt like a good production, like we should be able to make those at a reasonable cost in production and the appearance, and that's how we ended up there. So it was a stand-in, at that time it was a press type of a thing. It was pre-production and the decision wasn't made. And so, ended up going down the path of the jewel that we saw right now. It was a factory in Kentucky that had experience making logos and nameplates for like Cadillacs and Escalades and Corvettes, and they make really nice, shiny and bright colored painted ones like that. But they make like 30,000 a year, so they might be making 5-10,000 a week. And we put this 16 cavity tool in there, and they had to metalize and paint and do all this, and it was this really just dusty, dirty facility. And they didn't really have much in the way of process controls and just a high degree of it was hot, and then it was like dirt on the floor. It was like almost a dirt floor factory in Kentucky, and they had fans blowing because they had paint, and it was like fumes everywhere and other nasty processes. And so they just were blowing dust everywhere, and the backs of the jewels would get specks of dust embedded in them. And we were like, hey, that doesn't meet our standards. We're trying to launch this thing, and this is our logo. And so it was just, they couldn't figure it out. And it was really, that company nearly went, or probably was contributing to them going bankrupt, because we're trying to build 200,000, 300,000 a week, and they're building them, but they're only passing like 5% of those. And it was craziness. And these are some of the things that just like we had to go through, is work with a supplier, figure out how to get their quality up. And if they couldn't, you had to find backup suppliers. And so it was crazy. The punchline of the story was, we were there one time and we put, do 10 coats of paint, the green paint, to build it up so it wasn't translucent and didn't have any marks or any from the paint rollers. We did it 10 times. And each time you put it through the roller, you turn it 90 degrees. And so it was set up in this conveyor belt that just went into like a square that just went around and around and around. And the lady was in the middle, and she would just rotate it 90 degrees, and we'd kind of sit there and watch her do it. And she's kind of like, these days, if she had a phone, she would have been like on her phone, like playing Candy Crush or something. But she was there doing something else, probably taking a smoke break or something. And my boss came one time, and we're there watching it, and we're there with the general manager, and we're like, okay, so how does she know when it's 10 coats of paint? And the general manager just belts out, well, she just knows. And so that was the war cry for this factory of, if we ever didn't know an answer, it was just like, she just knows. Everyone just knows,
Yeah, that was like the inside office joke.
I would like to say it was a positive rally cry for me, but it just wasn't.
She just knows.
Well,
how long did that were you like working with that company before it was like, all right, these guys aren't keeping up, we need to figure something else out? Was that like a couple weeks, months? I mean, like, how quick was
probably
that?
within about 6 months. The problem was that it was a really expensive tool, and we probably didn't build a second one. So I can't remember if we ended up deciding to build a second one, because tools like that take 16 weeks, 20 weeks. So we had so much demand, we couldn't take a tool offline without having a backup. And the only other backup we had was a really small 4 cavity, which we could do to like use to prove out like someone knows how to do it. But it wouldn't clearly be enough to build up any amount of volume or do anything once we took down the other one. There's always a risk of bringing up that other company, maybe not getting into being able to do any better. Eventually we did. I think we did have to build a second tool. The second company came up and they were doing it. But then I eventually found a third company that was actually making some really awesome parts, using some really amazing automation. And they were just really great to work with. And they were in North Dakota, of all places. But they were like some of the best folks and smartest engineers I've ever worked with. And I just looked at them and I said, hey, I got this problem over here. Can you guys figure out, can you figure out a way to make so many of these, do this process, make them, inspect them so that don't have black marks in them, and hit this price point, by the way. that was really aggressive. And they kind of like went off for like a month and they kind of noodled on it. And they came back and they're like, yeah, we can do it. And the thing that's like really hard to do is that like a lot of people don't have the process for metallizing. But this company was Imation, which was a spinoff of 3M, and they made all those like 2.5-inch discs that we all used to have.
Oh, yeah.
They made those, and they had like 5 automation lines. They made like 1.5 million of those a day out of South Dakota or North Dakota. And they just took that machine. They knew how to engineer. They knew how to do process control, and they would just turn the knob on their machine and figure out how to do like 5% better and 5% better and 5% better. And what they did is they showed me, they're like, hey, check these out. When they're making the Joule, they saw them like, these are great. What'd you guys do? And they're like, well, we had an old 13-inch laser disc metallizer in our spares in our storeroom or whatever. So we made a little 5-up jig or 6-up jig, and we could, metallize 6 or 7 of them at a time in there every so many seconds. And then they did a paint process, and they just did it really well. They did it with a silk screen, and then they had a vision inspection system, like 20 years ago they had it for the disk drives. If it said diskette on the little metal slidey part, and they had a little apostrophe for the over the E that was like a 1/4 point size font or something. It was something ridiculously small. And they're like, well, we know how to inspect it in case that gets smudged. And they're like, we're using that same camera to inspect for any microscopic black marks, and they could figure this out. It was amazing.
Wow.
It was that one part was made in probably one of the worst factories I've ever seen in the world, and another factory both in the US that was probably one of the best I've ever seen in the world. And it was, just different approach for trying to solve a problem. It was crazy.
Yeah, and I'd say you guys solved the crap out of it. It's kind of unfortunate that the more modern consoles don't have something like that. I mean, the way that it picks up the light and stuff, and of course, it's very iconic to just the entire brand and the branding language of the Xbox. So
Yeah.
it's awesome that you guys spent that much time and effort for this kind of very important piece. I mean, it's called the Jewel for the reason, right? It's almost like a jewel on a crown, so to speak, right?
That's the reason why it had inordinate amount of focus. It was the brand, it was the logo. We sat there and we talked about it, and I could sit there and say, it was hard for me to say, it's like, nobody's ever going to return an Xbox because the Jewel has a black mark on it. But at the same time, and I'm sure no one ever did, but at the same time, you can't say that it's okay for your logo to go out there with black marks on them, right? So
right.
It
turns out she didn't just know.
No, it was bad.
Yeah.
I mean, I felt really sorry
Visual.
for them, and it was just, they seemed, we were pinched on time. It was maybe a poor choice on picking that they looked like they had the right capability, but it was a case where they just didn't have the right capability for the scale, and they didn't have the right process for quality control. So it was unfortunate, but lesson learned.
Well, we're talking about the special edition. What material were the regular jewels made out of in that case?
The clear hard ones was acrylic.
Okay, thank you.
And I couldn't tell you like specifically what grade it was. I don't remember, but it was an acrylic, and it's, I think, just because it has like higher clarity, and it holds a polish pretty well on the tool and things like that.
So Marco, speaking of the Jewel, did I hear you say earlier that you guys were experimenting with underlighting or LEDs or anything like that?
No, we talked about it. There was definitely I'm trying to remember, like, going back to like some of those, like, those the block of aluminum ones. I can't remember if that little
the prototypes. Yep.
Yeah, the early prototypes, if they had backlighting under those or not. I probably don't even know if I've ever seen one. But we had little like clocks and things like that were copies of those. So for sure, like, the industrial design direction would have been like, can we make this thing light up? We definitely wanted to figure out if there was a way to make the Jewel light up. And I think in my early days, we even went as far to try to like figure out, like, could we put LEDs under there? What kind of budget would it take to put a little circuit board? But when we started talking about, but we're like, how would we put it together? How would we kind of run a wire from the bottom, to the top, or we
Yeah.
have like spring con, and it quickly died because it was like, this is just too much. Let's save it for later if we ever get around to it. And we just never did it. But there was talk, and EL paper was, I think, pretty new at that time. So it was like, oh, there's this thing here, and it, could we make it glow in the dark? Could we do this? Could we do that?
That's unfortunate. I mean, it's a very popular mod in our modding community of people will commonly stick dental floss is a common trick. Heat it up from the back, stick dental floss down in there, pop it off, and then clear it out and all that. So that's one of the more popular mods. It sort of lends itself to that. So it's too bad, but I understand. When you do little things like that a million times, the cost adds up. It's like, is it worth it?
Yeah.
I mean, I would have paid it. That would have been cool for a special edition. You know what I mean? But
there was just no feasible way at any point beyond launch to go back and disrupt like the tooling and refigure it out. And
right.
I think like once modding became a thing, we were like, oh, that's awesome. We always knew that people wanted that, but it wasn't in the cart. It just wasn't something we could have pulled off. I am interested to hear how folks do take jewels off, because that's kind of a thing.
Funny enough, one of my first, I went and looked up one of my oldest accounts on one of the old Xbox farms, and one of my first contributions was a tutorial on how to clear out a jewel. And there's a couple different ways to do it, and it's all rather janky,
I can tell you one of the deep science, and this is actually a theme of my career. Like, one of the things that is almost always overlooked and not appreciated is how to get things, especially using pressure sensitive adhesives, to stick together the right way. And we had to learn that as well for the Xbox. And I can remember one of the first deliveries, I would say, was probably a pre-production batch, but a very, very, very early batch, when we ever got the very first full pallet from Mexico up in our hallway, and people were like, oh, they're here. And we're checking them out.
Yeah.
And all the managers are getting them to open them up, or, they're all earmarked for some special kind of testing or something.
Must have been like Christmas.
Yeah, it kind of was. There's a lot of, and there's a lot of pride that the first pallet was there. They were in the very first cosmetic boxes, the consumer boxes, and it was the first time we could kind of do an out-of-box experience test and things like that. And I kind of I don't know if I got called into someone's office, but I definitely heard about it right away, which was, people were like, where the heck's the jewel? And we're like, what? I was in Mexico last week when we were building these. I saw them. Like, why didn't you guys put the jewel on them? We're like, what do you mean? We didn't ship these without jewels. And what happened is I don't think we were using a process to press the jewels on at the time, and we also didn't have that little foamy. We had a little layer of foam in the jewel. It was just like a flat PSA, double-sided, and the plastic, between the plastic on the case and the plastic on the back of the jewel, they're not exactly flat, and it only touches in a couple spots, and if it doesn't stick. Well, the jewels were falling off because the way the boxes were in the pallets, they're on their sides or something. And jewels were falling off in shipment, and then they'd fall and they'd stick to the ribs on the side or some weird place. So we'd open a box up, there'd be no jewel, and it was stuck to the side somewhere. And that was, kind of embarrassing. But we figured it out quickly that you just had to, we found a stronger adhesive, and then we put a little bit of a foam core in it to kind of build in a little compliance between the wavy surfaces. And we built a little press, because pressure sensitive adhesive needs pressure to activate. So every one of them got pushed on, and kind of this process where we put the top metal cover into the top plastic and applied the jewel at the same time, and then it pressed it together and held it for about 10 or 15 seconds. And kind of once we figured out that process and dialed it in, they never came off. But we were doing something, I was in Hungary, and we were trying to take the jewel off for some reason, and I was in the tool shop with this big Hungarian guy, engineer, and we had a flathead screwdriver that was 18 inches long, wedged in there into the little recess in between them, trying to wedge it out. And that adhesive was so strong that generally a couple of weird things would happen, which is we'd crack the acrylic in half, or the adhesive would stay stuck to the paint, but the paint would separate, or we would literally like pull up a section of the plastic. It was so crazy that I can tell you we solved that problem really quick. Like that adhesive would not break. And
Yeah, I
I
have
think
some
that
personal experience with how strong that is. Yeah.
if you're using floss, you're likely cutting into the foam in between the two layers of adhesive, I'm guessing.
Yeah, we kind of have
Yeah.
to saw through it. I think the first time I ever cracked the top case in two was from when I tried freezing it, cooling it down and hitting the back with a mallet,
Yeah.
basically. First time I ever cracked a case was doing that. So you guys secured the crap out of that thing. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about, so just talking about special editions and stuff, there's that infamous picture, and I shared it in the Discord channel here, of you with the orange cases, which that became a whole separate thing. How many would you say orange case Xboxes exist currently? I want to say that in the past you said it was somewhere around like 3 or 4, right?
Yeah, clearly more turned up than I remembered, because the one I remember two, like for certain, because I had taken one and I like dumpstered, like we had disposal bins of just filled with chassis of like all like motherboards and everything. And generally there'd be some weird configuration, like I was talking about it earlier, like the Samsung hard optical drive doesn't work with the WD hard drive or something, and they would just, like, if it didn't work for whatever they wanted, they just like pitch it into the dumpster. And like you can go into our dumpster in our test room and grab one, and it would, like, more often than not be a console that you could figure out how to get to work.
Yeah, some minor issue.
Yeah, like, or no issue at all for whatever reason. And as far as you could tell, or as far as I could tell. So I made one for a friend for whatever reason. I gave it to him, and I made one for one of our marketing managers, because I worked with her for all these like Hulk and Pepsi and some of the other. Those were more like the marketing special editions versus some of the consumer special editions. So I clearly remember making those two, and then I must have made one for my boss, because his daughter, like, one turned up a few weeks ago or a few months ago, like his daughter pulled one out of a storage unit, and like, well, that makes sense. It was my boss's daughter. And the fact that we had to take a production tool from Mexico, ship it to upstate New York, do that trial where you see us in front of the machine. That was at GE Color Express. We thought that those were really potential to be the next type of special edition, because of we thought they would use it as a Xbox Live special edition, and we thought that made a lot of sense to us. We thought it was a no-brainer. So I had all the top covers, sent to me, and then I had I had a batch of that plastic, made and then sent to Mexico, because all the other tools were down there. So I had enough parts, and it was probably like a box or two of parts, and a box or two of parts might have been like 10 or 20. And I had them in my office for a long time. So I probably had about 10 or 20 orange sets of plastics, and made a handful of them.
So the ones that we've seen pop up publicly, for example, the one that was shown in Metal Jesus Rocks' video, so some at least had the Halo badge on there. How did that come to be?
Those would have only been put on in the factory. The only other place that did some special pad printing outside of the Mexican factory was Japan for some of their special editions. So didn't we do a green one? We did a green one that was a Halo special edition, right?
Yeah, the official one. Yep.
Yeah, the official one.
I think there's two green ones.
Right. There was a couple of green ones. So what I think I'm almost positive this is what happened, is we said, hey, when you're making some green Halo ones, can you also, like, while that tool is making a non-production color, so like the not black, make me some of this orange. And I probably had those done at the same time, because I'm taking these tools off of production. So I would have run as many of these little color samples as I could. And what probably happened is the factory didn't know the difference to not do the pad printing. So they just did the pad printing, and they sent them up to me, and I'm like, no big deal, because we're not doing anything with these right now. So I'm fairly certain that's the most plausible. And what actually happened is that I was doing either these orange ones on the tail end of when we were doing either a production or a trial for the green halos. So the tools were offline from production black and doing this, and that would have been what they did. And they just, it was a happy accident or whatever you want to say.
Yeah, and last time we were talking, you illuminated us with a phrase that has sort of taken notoriety. You referred to so we called those dark clear consoles, the Japanese versions. We called those skeleton or smoke editions. And then when you referred to it as dark crystal, it's sort of we're like, all right, this is the new standard. The man has spoken. We're calling it these from here on out. Did you guys have official, unofficial names for these things when you were talking about them with each other like that? Like, was the orange one, a certain name or anything like that?
Well, the orange one never made it to a point that it would have had a name. And
Mhm.
this goes back to the hard drive crash where I did have a list of all the configurations and probably the dates we ran them and exactly how many we made. And what would have been I would call it like the color code, or this might be the Pantone. The whole green ones were like Pantone 376. Like that's the kind of like the Xbox green color. And so
Okay.
the plastics don't come in Pantones, they come in the custom color formulation that we tell GE or GE assigns to it. So it might, I can't remember what the material was, but all of the
Mhm.
clear materials were a PCABS, and I don't remember the grade, but it would have been like PCABS 3202 1157 orange, and 1157 might be like the color code for orange and something like that. And so, but in the hallways, I think if I was talking to the industrial designer, this would have been like Xbox Live Orange.
Mhm.
And they would have said, wait, is that a crystal? Or like we kind of call, because, the dev kits or the beta kits were all either clear or green. Sometimes they called those crystal clear. When we talked to Japan, and I worked with a Japan marketing manager, he kind of would use the term smoke, or we had a number of, I think I have a picture somewhere, and I pulled out my portable hard drives right now. I still have some drive pictures, but I think I probably have a picture of some of the other candidate colors for Japan. But like as far as we're like, I don't know if it was like widely adopted, but we did call it dark crystal. He might refer to it as smoke once in a while, but I think more generically it was fairly widely like dark crystal. But it was just like most people, I would say, outside of me and a very small group of people would just say like, hey, the Japan color or something like
Yeah.
that.
In one of those photos that we or that I shared there in the channel, you can kind of see you taking a look at looks like color plates to decide upon potential colors for limited editions. It looks like so. Besides the orange, blue, green, dark crystal, were there any that got further along that maybe you would have liked to see become a limited edition? Like,
Well,
did you guys make like a red one and you're like, oh my god, that looks amazing, and then it didn't end up happening? You know what I
yeah,
mean?
so that's Jim with the black shirt. He's our industrial designer, and we actually, so probably on closest to the edge of the table is like that orange one, which we ended up running. Well, they ran it already. We told them what color. There was a red one there, and we kind of looked at it and we were like, boy, it would be tremendously ugly or tremendously cool. We weren't quite sure on that. I guess I don't know if you guys can see this, but like the one next to my elbow on the left is a glow in the dark that they made. So GE made a couple other colors there on their own. And I brought back, of all things, that one's never turned up. And I think I gave it to an office mate of mine. That guy's a pack rat. But that glow in the dark one, it looked like it didn't look good in any way, but it's a really cool one. In the picture with the orange ones, the one on the left there, it's kind of like a ruby, clearish, reddish color, maroon color. I don't know if you guys can tell that. We didn't like those. We probably never even took one home, and we probably told them to shred them and destroy them. They might have looked good, but it was just so off. The color palette wasn't anywhere in the brand. And so it just didn't make sense from a brand perspective. The other
Yeah, that
crazy,
makes
crazy
sense.
one that's on that table that's outside of the view is that GE made, they're like, well, we're just playing around. And I can't remember what color it was. It was kind of like a really maybe it was greenish, maybe it was, I don't know, it was solid or translucent, and they put metamerizing beads in it. So it kind of, they were trying to see if they could do like a color shifting finish that you can kind of see on like
Oh,
some
like a
cards.
pearlescent effect.
Yeah, it's like a pearlescent, but it, you know, it diffracts and it's metamerizing. So they made it, it looked like hell because of all the flow lines. You just can't put beads in there. They don't disperse evenly. So it's like on that table just out of view. And I'm sure I didn't bring any of those home. But yeah.
I think you mentioned you have one of those green dukes as a footrest or something like that. I remember you saying that at some point. Do you have any sort of lingering stuff that you kind of hang on to that sits as a sort of trophy from that time and such, or a
Um,
memorabilia?
I don't think I have any dukes. I I gave away a lot of, like, in some of the photos there were like those sheets of special editions. I think I gave a few. I don't I, they were probably the Mountain Dew ones. I think I gave them to the Strong Museum. I gave a few. I probably had a the keychain that went inside the Japanese launch. I gave away a few little trinkets. The
Mhm.
only things I really have, and I'm kind of in the process again of moving. And every time I move, I like go find the box where I have stuff. I have my launch edition console, and I have my Panzer Dragoon, the Panzer Dragoon, which is atrociously yellowed and it looks so bad. But um, those are my two main keepsakes that I have.
Yeah, those are pretty infamous consoles. And that old thread that we were chatting in from 2016, where during that time I had gotten a launch team edition Xbox, and I was just seeing if at the time people thought that there was 60 of them. And I was like, where did we get this idea? And then you actually chimed in and you were like, no, there's actually 1,000 of them, and cleared up some of the misconceptions, I guess.
I'm sorry,
But
that was
during
for
that thread, you also brought up the
the employee
yeah, for the
edition.
partners and for the launch
Oh,
team.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Like we had thought that there was way fewer than there actually were, and you were able to kind of clear that up. But in that thread, you also mentioned how much of a pain in the butt it was to do those Panzer cases,
The
right?
Panzer
Was
ones, it's a classic story in terms of the best of times and the worst of times. You know, there's just times that are great to learn, and I learned a lot from the gentleman Kenji Nakayama, who was our marketing manager from Tokyo, MSKK. He was one of our main interfaces for hardware, and he taught me what it was like to deliver product into Japan and what the expectations of the market were, which were much higher than probably anywhere else in the world. And so, one, you know, we had this idea. He had the idea of like, we're going to put the logo on these white Xboxes. So, you know, I'm almost positive the Apple started making hardware and everybody wanted something that was Apple white. And so I had to call GE and say, hey, can you formulate me something that matches the white of Apple for the, you know, probably the 7 millionth time that someone called them that week to do it. And they're like, oh, we might know how to do that. And so we made a formulation of the plastic in that color, you know, which was just basically a ripoff of Apple colors. And then this thing, we want to do this pattern. I think he probably went through a couple iterations of like, what do we think is possible? And then I'd ask the factory, like, what do we think is possible? And we're like, well, we'll try this one with the lines. And so we got down there. It was their special deal. We're going to go down there and watch them make it and kind of approve it all at once. And I probably had them make, well, actually, here's how it used to work. I could, I could get small lot batches of like 50-pound bags, or I can get a Gaylord pallet of I don't know how many pounds, but it was probably like, let's say 2,000 pounds, maybe 3,000 pounds of material to have a little extra. And each Xbox was roughly a kilo, so like 2.2 pounds of plastic. And we definitely had enough to make a little bit more than 1,000 with the spare. So it ended up like it probably was 2 or 3,000 of these consoles, and we figured out like we're going to screen print it on. They said they hired a vendor, they did some samples, it looked okay, so we flew to Mexico, and we're there in an evening with this kid who was like literally like a screen printer off the side of the street doing t-shirts or something. He had like this wooden frame screen printer and not much else. And we just sat there with him, and he kind of started doing them by hand. And I think he probably had some already done. And we started sorting through them. And because of the texture on the top, the ink would kind of bleed off, and sometimes it wouldn't be very neat or orderly. And I'd agree, like they look bad, but we were scrutinizing these at a very, very high level. And so, long story is,
Right.
like, we probably screen printed 2 or 3 thousand of them, and we only ended up keeping about 1,300. So I think Japan wanted maybe a little more than that, but the best we could do by like individually inspecting every single one was about 1,300, and we were probably in the factory doing that overnight. I think we didn't leave until about 4 in the morning.
Sounds like a nightmare. You're just stuck there squeegeeing and screen printing and reviewing these things.
He was there all night, and I don't know what he was getting paid, but he would like screen print it, and we'd sit there and like maybe let it dry, and we'd look at the other, and like we'd look at it and just be like, nope, 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 yes, no, just
Yeah,
keep going. And it was just it was brutal.
that's wild. It seemed like the US seemed to have the least amount of special editions. Is it safe to say that those special editions were kind of used to boost those other markets? Like I know in Japan, there was a couple special editions that were exclusive to that region. Was it sort
Yeah,
of to make it a big deal and try to boost sales in those regions?
yeah, that's right. I mean, that was definitely something I learned. Like if you go there and you see like Kit Kats, and there's like strawberry version Kit Kat, or there's like
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Coke in or like Oreo flavors that you've never seen, or just something like that. And it's just kind of like how their market works, is that this is very generalizing, but they want new things on their shelf all the time to kind of like spur buying cycles. And so it's kind of just built into, what they come to expect in the retail marketplace. And so Japan, we always knew was going to be a tough market, home of Sony. We had so many uphill battles against us to try to penetrate into there because of either the size of the console, home team advantage for Sony, rightfully so, the games, just the differences in the market and all of that. So you needed something to differentiate yourself to spur buying cycles. And so whether it was special editions were a way to do that. And so like we did the Panzer Dragoon, but I think there was like a blue one that was DOA.
Right, right.
And what we did, we kind of made a deal with the Japanese team, and they said, like, we're going to need to do just like more of this stuff. Why don't you just ship us some of these colored ones? And if we want to do a screen print or we want to do something special, we'll do that ourselves in country. So that's how like the blue DOA ones happened. We just ended up sending them, like the standard blue ones with, certain configuration, and they just took them and they set up their own little process to do the DOA, or I'm sure there's a variety of them. And that's where it kind of got out of like my control of what were official. We kind of called those almost like second party special editions, because they were, legit ones that we sent to our Microsoft team in Japan. And then they kind of did their own branding deals with, special game studio release. And I know that
Right.
there's probably several of those, but I just can't think of them. But there, there were ones that people showed that were like fairly exotic, and I can't. It was actually got hard for me to delineate which were ones that they did and or didn't do, and that's kind of like where I then started like losing track. Or a lot of the third party people, like then skins got to be really big, and then it really started to take off. There was a ton of like it was like the 50 cent one and things like that. Like I don't think we ever did those.
Oh,
Those
right,
were
right.
all like getting consoles from us and then sending them out and doing them in other ways. The only other crazy thing I can think that we ever did with a special edition, I think when we made like the millionth or the 10 millionth one, we had a few of them like spray painted gold. Like literally someone went out and spray painted them gold, and we signed
Mhm.
them and gave them to like Bill Gates and Robbie Bach and something like that. So
Oh,
somebody like,
that's cool. I've never heard of that before. So that's
yeah,
just sitting on Bill's shelf somewhere, probably.
I'm
Hopefully.
sure. Yeah, I don't know. It's in a storage box somewhere, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Again, that one, like someone sent it off somewhere to get in like oh my God, it looked horrible. I don't know if you ever tried to do it, and then like, I think Jay Allard's admin just said, F it, I'm going to go spray paint it myself. And it ended up looking better than somebody else.
That's in big part thanks to just the design of the of the actual plastics and stuff. It's easy to make it look good. I've spray
I don't
painted a
know.
couple of those myself, and
you
it's
got a lot
yeah,
of things working against you. It's definitely not made to be painted, but that's what. And when some of those, let's say, aftermarket folks though started, that catching on, I would say that directly influenced the desire to do the replaceable front piece with different skins for the 360 for sure.
right. Was that ever considered for the original Xbox, or was that not even
No.
a thought?
No, I mean, no.
Yeah,
The fact that we pad printed like Halo or Special Edition on the corner, and I think the fact that we did like the Panzer Dragoon was pretty exotic for like, let's say, us in North America. And then the fact that Japan figured out ways to maybe push it a little bit further for the first gen was like pretty far out there, because it wasn't something that like I had or someone on our team would have had time to go figure out. So, at that point it was the market necessity and they figured it out. And at that point in time, I was kind of happy to let them do it, because it wasn't a big deal to do like one or two like big runs of like blue or green special editions a year, but like two or three, and they wanted, in the process we had to go through to kind of like, would it work, send it over there, get it approved, no, they want to change it, or they want to see 3 or 4 options, and it was just the process. And so it was better for them to own it.
So talking about the Japan market and stuff, were you involved at all with the Xbox video chat camera accessory?
No. What sort of happened is, so the controller team started to expand into other peripherals. And so they were always exploring other things. And so like, I mean, I don't remember if it was ever a public thing, but I know they're not like super uncommon, which is like, there were those little Xbox Live kits that had like a little third-party headset and a controller and things like that in it.
Right.
So like that headset would have just been a third-party device that someone said, hey, go make it for us, but like put our branding on it. And there was a gentleman that did in the first generation Xbox that did all these like third-party relationships. And so he would work with let's say the OEMs that weren't Microsoft, but we would license to them the ability, like we would authorize them to go make stuff. That's not answering your question about the camera. And so he was able to go work with like people like Mad Cats and these people that made like authorized controllers or authorized other peripheral devices, which I think were mostly just controllers. The team internally and kind of around, would work with other OEMs, and like we had the TID, right? Like the text input device that would sit between that could like plug in. And we had that little,
it's like a primitive version of the chat pad, the keyboard thing.
a little keyboard. Yeah. We call it
Right.
the TID. So they would have been working on that. And then the camera, I don't know like when or where, if I even remember ever seeing it or what. But so I honestly, it's like, sorry, I can't tell you much about it, but
No, that's fine. I was just curious if you had dealt with that at all, because it's a pretty obscure device, and like not a lot of people even know that it exists. It was released in Japan, and it was from what I know, a very limited release.
There's like, I could tell you one or two things. It's like it could be a second or a third party device that we authorized through Japan for whatever specific use case, or it could have come out of the peripheral team, which in the first generation was primarily controllers. In Xbox 360, there was a more concerted effort to have more peripheral different types of devices, also including like the hard drives, the front plates, different controller skins, SKUs, things like that. And then eventually like that expanded into like a pretty profitable part of the Xbox 360 ecosystem. And that was very intentional by design coming out of the first generation. So every year the team was growing like 50%. It was just the first year where it was like less than 50 or 100 of us, and the second year it was like 150, and then it was just like by the time I left there's 500 or 600 people working on hardware. It was crazy.
Jeez, that's some decent growth there.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm looking at that camera, like looks vaguely familiar. That's the same little jewel that we put on the controllers. I'm wondering if there's any manufacturer's markings on it, if it was like made by Chicone or Mitsumi.
I feel like Harcroft probably couldn't tell you that. He'd probably be more familiar than I would be about it.
As far as we know, I'm the only person to have taken one apart, but also the only person to document it inside. And it's all Microsoft markings inside on the PCB. I think there's some stamped markings on the plastic too that show Microsoft.
Yeah, honestly, that's likely because the person that I took over their job, that I said the guy that went onto the peripherals team, is likely a project that he probably did with Misumi or Chicone, because Chicone was like making a lot of mice and keyboard products for the PC hardware team.
There is, in the software side, there's some config files that have weird date stamps on them, and there's a full name of Jeff something in the actual config files for the sensors in the software. It's kinda neat.
Interesting. I wonder if it's Jeff Alexander.
It's a very Japanese sounding name.
Oh, then I would not know.
Marco, I know you touched basis earlier regarding the GPU on the Xbox. And what we did notice is the early revisions, like the 1.0, had active cooling with a fan on there. But any revision after that, they just went with a passive heatsink. Would you know anything about that by any chance?
Yeah, you know what? I don't remember that second fan, the small one on the GPU. You know, honestly, I just don't remember anything about it. I definitely remember the big one, the big exhaust fan. I just don't recall the conditions around why we did or didn't have it. I mean, I think the obvious one in the beginning is because we thought we might need it and we weren't sure. And until we had enough time to test and figure it out, or there were some issues potentially resolved with the ultimate updates and configurations from NVIDIA, like there could have been potentially some like structural layers that I mean I'm purely speculating here, so it's not even worth like, you know, I know that there was a number of configuration issues that we had to respin, and some of the early launch problems were deep in the metal, and so they would have to restart the fabs or catch the boats at a certain point of time in the fab process so that they can make the changes or continue with the next step in the fabrication process. And it's kind of out of my depth, but there was a lot of that going on to fix these issues. And then we would get the first off the line GPUs, they plug them in, we'd build them and get them up here right away and figure out. And we would actually start manufacturing the motherboards. And I went through that process probably, I can tell you how many times I went through this, because I don't know where on the board, probably where it says Microsoft or somewhere down there. The first board that should have went to the public, I believe, would have been what we called like Rev K. And we started at, we intended to start at A. So we revved the PCB to adapt to changes in the motherboard in the GPU, like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, K, like 9 times before we actually got and like would start. So like I'd have to order 30,000 boards to start, get them hot lotted through the PCB factory, get them air shipped, and then start production, and then tell them no, stop production and throw those away. So I had to do that 8 times.
Wow. And how big you say the production run was on that? Like each time you had a revision?
We would have them, like, for whatever reason, the number 30,000 sticks in my mind. Like we would have a hot lot of 30,000 boards airshipped from Taiwan to Guadalajara.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And they would presume they were good, so they would make them, and then the first 10 or 20 someone would either be in the factory or someone would fly them back to Seattle or Redmond and test them and be like, nope, these don't work, or these have the issue, stop the line.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of what was happening, like between June and September when we were trying to ramp production.
And did these boards come pre-programmed, or were they programmed in another part of the factory. So I guess you say the firmware or the BIOS, the
Yeah.
MCPX.
Someone had that video, and I don't know, I haven't seen that video in a while, or if maybe I haven't seen it at all. So the way the console assembly was generally laid out was, let's see, in Mexico, they had 2 or 3 SMT lines, so they would do all the board population, and the assembly lines were almost right next to the SMT lines. So then they would go into, we had bed of nails programming fixtures, and so then they would get flashed with like a manufacturing build, and then they would finish manufacturing, and then they would get plugged in at the end of the line, and they would get the production build, or they would do like a final test, and then the final step in the test is to wipe the manufacturing build and put the production build on it. But generally like the BIOS and the low level stuff is all done on like the bed of nails testers.
I have a random question, and this kind of touches on something that we spoke about probably like an hour ago at this point. So when the Xbox originally launched, it had the big Duke controller as it's known, right?
Yeah.
Later on, the S controller was launched, and apparently that was related to the Japanese market not receiving the giant Duke controller. Yeah. I mean, the Xbox itself was rather big in a modest Japanese household, right? So there was that whole like Western, it's almost like bringing in a Ford F-150 and parking it in there, in a compact space. Were you a part of that conversation or a part of that era when I'm just trying to like find out, how did that come about? Like, was that just a fear that happened and someone had the foresight to say, hey, we need a smaller controller? Was it like a big rush to get that smaller type controller in production? What was that process like?
Yeah, I was, let's say, close to some of it. And I've had some experience in later life also, like, building controllers. And the ergonomics of it are very important. And I'm not going to, like, the touch and the feel, they're all very personable and like personal and have to like work for their purpose. And the button layouts are so important, the position. And like people like really, really, really put a ton of effort in like trying to make it as useful as it can, but still kind of like challenging the look and feel and trying to be different, But I can say like there was a lot of it. There's always a lot of iterations that go into it, and how and why they thought Duke was the right answer, or Dakota, or any of these other ones. Like I can't tell you, but they thought they were making the right. They do a lot of play testing. They do international. I think that they knew that Duke would never fly in Japan, let alone the console was, again, they called it the coffee table in Japan. But your F1.
Yeah, the F-150.
It's very appropriate.
It's basically that. Japan's used to smart cars, and here comes, a big diesel, Western console trying to shake up the market.
We heard all that and worse. And so I think there was a fairly explicit mandate to have a smaller controller for Japan by the time they were going to launch in Japan. And they almost, I think, had it controller S in time for North America launch, but wasn't quite that ready. So it was in the works. They knew they had to do better by the market. And Japan at that point, MSKK, would have had a strong say, and they were probably saying, "No way that we're going to sell Duke."
And MSKK being the
Japanese subsidiary,
Japanese division.
Yeah.
Okay. If I recall correctly, one of the reasons why the Duke was in the form factor that it was not necessarily because they thought that it was the best size, but rather because that was they were working within the constraints of the board. So the PCB itself kind of influenced the board. So, I guess I'm just wondering if technology advances, parts get smaller, and that allowed them to make the S controller. But you're saying that the S controller was already planned for the North American market prior to it coming out in Japan. And did Japan just sort of put pressure on it to come out sooner, for example?
No, sorry. I think that I may have misspoke. And I think that they knew that Duke wasn't ever going to make it to Japan, and they knew that pretty quick, but I couldn't tell you the strokes of how everything played out there. So they were working on controller S and which we also called Akibono. I don't know if that's known or not. And it almost, I would have said, like potentially made it in for North America, and then eventually it did. I think we just killed Duke eventually, and everything was Controller S. I think that's what happened. So yeah, Controller S was like, I think it was a necessity to make it, and I think we had maybe aspirations of maybe getting away with one controller, but that being said, there isn't a ton of, you don't need a ton of space in a controller for the number of ICs and things on there. So I also kind of find it hard to
Yeah.
be true.
It's been awesome hearing from you this whole time. We're at like an hour and a half here, and I really appreciate your time. I hope we're not pissing off your wife or anything like that.
No, they're on.
There's a couple of questions. Okay, good. There was a couple of questions I had, and then we'll try to find a good stopping point here soon, because I know you got to get to bed eventually. So one was I know you were more on the sort of hardware side of it, and a lot of stuff that we do in our community is more in the software and tinkering and all that kind of stuff. Do you have any insight into what you guys kind of thought about of us modders and tinkers on this other side? I think in our last conversation, I asked if you've ever even used a modded Xbox, and I think you said no, right? Do you have any insight as far as like what the general perspective of modders was back in the day?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to, like, if you go through the timeline, the fact that like modding didn't exist until, let's say, there were enough Xboxes out in the market for folks to feel comfortable with, potentially destroying them or jailbreaking them or violating the terms or opening them up and not knowing what they were doing and potentially destroying. So it wasn't obviously a thing that happened on day one. I think we started to see, there's the people that were like the leaders out there doing it. And I'm fairly certain to a strong degree that even during that era, 99.99% of the people were like, oh, that's kind of cool. People are doing that. Now, there were the people obviously that were like, oh, they shouldn't be doing that because it's like gonna, I don't know, take away revenue for us or blah, 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 like you're putting games on. But, there's lawyers and people like that that are like, have to say that stuff. And I would say like some of the, what generally happens is people that are figuring out how to unlock and jailbreak them, they're like, oh, the designers are like, oh, we got to close that hole. Oh, we have a vulnerability. And within, and that's kind of a game.
Sure,
but
sure.
I don't think that, especially in retrospective, like, I think people kind of thought it was awesome that one, there was just this interest, and two, that they could do it. And, the other thing that people like internally were like, well, it's not that much of a stretch. It's just a PC, it's not that different.
Yep.
Except that they made a reasonable effort to just lock it down so it only played games that they decided they wanted to play. But fundamentally, the approach was, it wasn't even a very much modified Intel Pentium 3, right? It was literally like an off-the-shelf design that they just made the SKUs just for us so that they could identify it, and it worked with our hardware and with our motherboard configuration. And Intel did the design for the motherboard already, and it's and it was an NVIDIA chip that was just like a generation or two ahead of time that we paid NVIDIA a bunch of money to go develop, and they did. And so from that standpoint, like the fact that it's a very capable piece of hardware that can do whatever folks want to go do, like, that's great.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would have said like the predecessors or the early people were kind of like, it was a small community of enthusiasts, and we're like, oh, that's interesting. I don't think that was like, but it was like, well, we got to go back to work to make the next one. And so the fact that it kind of just continued to grow and grow and grow, I don't feel that there was ever, I think there's admiration. I think there's like, oh, that's a cool thing to do. I can remember walking around talking to some of the people, and I was just like, good on them. Go have fun. We're a lot of people I think are kind of like they came from they're hackers too, and I just don't like, it wasn't a big deal. I just don't think it was a big deal. I think it's a great, it's easier to look back in retrospect and say it's lived and it's awesome. And it's like, no one would say like this is a bad thing, today.
nowadays it's almost recommended to mod your console, not necessarily because you don't want to pay for it, but just because that's sort of getting around some of these limitations. We're dealing with aging hardware and stuff, and we don't want to step on people's toes, and something that the community is very aware of, to not necessarily take from their revenue source.
Yeah. I mean, you're extending at this point.
Sure.
Yeah. I don't think anybody at Microsoft is going to come after you for modding an Xbox One. I think it's pretty safe to say.
So there was rumors going around that, the Xbox was heavily influenced by, I guess, Sega or Sega's design. Other rumors going around is that the Xbox was essentially the Dreamcast 2. And some of us have seen sketches or artwork of, I guess, prototype designs of the controller. Do you know anything about that? Is it just a rumor? Was Sega somewhat involved somehow?
Actually, I would say it was Nintendo.
Mhm.
The GameCube had just come out a few years before, and there was a board and a GameCube that was torn down, and all the pieces were laid out on a board. And I asked, there's three electrical engineers that sat there, and I was like, what is this about? And they're like, the architecture of this is they're like, it's really low powered overall in the amount of memory and the processing power of whatever it had for a GPU. But they said it was like really bandwidth optimized for communicating internally. So it had a really efficient design. I'm probably butchering it to a degree, but they said that was more of what they were trying to go for than just like this brute force console. And so my understanding of that statement is that the EEs had more of a teardown and influence on this design based on the architecture of Nintendo than a Sega. I never saw any of the Sega systems torn down in our office or anything like that. And I had that conversation with, Greg Gibson and Harjit Singh, like two of the EE designers. I know that there were some crazy concepts that came out through the PC hardware team, because there was someone was showing some of those other like Sidewinder controllers, and there was, some of those people came over and had concepts that had come and developed from the PC gaming side. But I was like, before we get too far away from, sorry, go ahead.
So I think Seamus did comment on a Twitter post actually confirming there were like concept sketches, and he wasn't a big fan of them either.
Yeah, like that could be true. It could have been something they commissioned. They very likely could have sent a design brief out to 10 different ID firms around the world, and that would have been far before me. But I never saw these, and if they said they didn't like them, they probably put them in the bin and went on to the direction that they wanted. One interesting Intel Pentium, we were talking about the Intel Pentium 3 733s story. Everything that used to come in by ocean came into just south of Puerto Vallarta, Manzanillo on the coast of Mexico is their industrial port, and then it gets trucked about 100 miles inland, whatever the distance is, to Guadalajara. We had a truckload of Intel processors once get hijacked, and we lost it, and it didn't show up. And it was like, it could have been a year or 9 months later, we got a phone call. We worked with a lot of reps, so sometimes, we try to work directly with the factory or the direct source if we're buying, and sometimes not the middleman. But we got a call from someone who we knew was a local rep agency who repped, I guess, Intel from time to time or other silicon products. And he was like, "Hey, I got like a few thousand of the processors that are used in Xbox. You guys want to buy them?" And he didn't call me, but he literally like called the one of my counterparts, and they're like, "Yeah, send me some information on them, like send me some lot numbers, give me some pictures. I'd love to hear, a little more about that." And they sent them. And so unbeknownst to the person, but they were the hijacked units that someone had like bought them. And I think he was like honestly just trying to make a deal, and someone shady had had tracked him down and tried to use them to sell them back to us. But like, we only worked and bought those directly from Intel. So
Yeah.
my buddy, like the first thing they did, called the lawyers, called the FBI, and not sure exactly how that turned out, but like when things go like that, go quiet quickly, something
Yeah.
happened in that space. The other crazy story, I don't know, Scotch, if you have or if I sent, there's a very nondescript, kind of silly looking picture of a bunch of people in a hallway at Microsoft, and it's like there's Bill Gates on the side and there's a bunch of us sitting there. I don't know if you have that picture or if it's I feel like I've sent it out, but if you haven't seen it, it's not that big of a deal. It was just like a really funny day. We used to do like once a year or maybe once every 6 months, they would have kind of like an all hands demo day, and Balmer or Gates or both would kind of come down, and we have all the discipline teams. So like we might have manufacturing, and like every team would kind of be in a conference room, and we'd kind of do like a dog and pony show for them and show them like what's going on and create some presentations that had like crazy facts and kind of show off. And, it was like your chance to like be in the room with Bill Gates or something. And so that picture was taken right after our meeting with them. And so we had a whole manufacturing team, had supply chain, some of the quality folks, some of our planning, and most of our procurement, purchasing, manufacturing folks there. And it had to have been like late October, right before we launched. And we were like, my director tells my other director, make the presentation. And my director tells me, make the presentation. So I end up making the presentation of like, and it's like, don't put anything in there that Bill Gates is going to call you out on or something. Otherwise you're going to get fired. So we have this room. It looks like totally like 7th grade science fair with, we have like one of those videos that we commissioned of the factory. So like probably not too much different than the video that you had posted earlier. And we were showing them like, here's our NPI build. Here's our early build. Here's the factory. Here's how they do it. We had kind of poster boards all over the walls with like maps of Europe and maps of China and maps of Mexico with, like thumbtacks and string going from Asia to Mexico to kind of like, this is where all the stuff from Taiwan comes in, and this is where all the stuff from Asia comes in. And so we're sitting there doing it, and Bill's just like kind of sitting there, like rubbing his chin, watching the videos, like nodding. And we're like talking about, do you understand that the day before Xboxes, you even sell one of them, we have like $3 billion of finished goods and unfinished goods in our supply chain that you've paid for, basically, and trying to say like, this is 2,700 container trucks lined up from or some like obscene number, and like the number of Xboxes that we have ready to go on the shelf could fill the Superdome. And we're like just telling him all these like crazy things about trying to like understand like the scale of, large scale, high volume manufacturing is. And he's just kind of like just rubbing his chin and nodding his head and just kind of like, oh, that's really interesting. And he goes like, he kind of like looks up at the board, and he looks at the port where the Manzanillo, where the industrial port is. And he's like, oh, Manzanillo, I like to go to vacation there. And he like, he likes it so much that he bought like the Four Seasons like down there, and like bought the whole hotel. and he's kind of like, he goes like, what day does the boat come in? And we're like, what do you mean the boat? And he means like the boat with all the parts. And we're like, well, there's ships coming from Taiwan with all the motherboards, and there's ships coming from Malaysia with all the controllers, and there's ships coming from the mainland with heat sinks and all the doodads. It's like you could basically walk across the Pacific Ocean on the number of container ships we have, bringing us stuff, and they're coming like every day. So like there is a constant flow of ships coming, continuously to keep this going. And he was just like all the things that people have said about like, he'll call out folks or tear it down. But he was like, we all kind of got really relaxed in our seats. We're like, oh, Bill kind of doesn't, he might be a computer genius, but he's just like, he's not the supply chain guru. Like that's one area where we're all going to keep our jobs. So we're all kind of like really happy about that. Yeah. I was like, okay, I think we're okay. He's not going to throw a tantrum. We're not going to have Balmer like throwing a PowerPoint presentation at us. We're okay.
Well, it's been about an hour and a half or so. This has probably been a little bit longer than I had anticipated. I didn't want to have you come on in your first appearance and kind of burn you out. So And I appreciate all the time you've been spending with us. I really do. It's kind of obscure and it's 20 years ago, but this is all stuff that we love hearing about. This console is quite beloved to us, and yeah, there's just a lot going on with it. And if you're interested and you want to take me up on the offer, I'll totally send you a care package one of these days with, just a modded console so you can get an idea of what these things can do. It's almost like theoretically, what could it do? Can it run Linux? Can it be a media center and all that? And there's a lot that it can do that, would probably be surprising,
Oh yeah.
So
I
if
mean,
you're interested in that, I'll get your
well,
shipping details and we'll send one over to you.
We'll check one out sometime for sure. Definitely after I settle down from moving. But yeah, I mean, happy to be on here. Happy to come on again or just chat or hang out some other times too. And happy, know where to find you guys too.
We'd love to have you back. And like I said, we kind of recently have been getting together more often. We've just been seeing a big influx of new people coming into the scene and just people who have maybe didn't experience the console back during its heyday. And nowadays they're like $20-$30 and people will get them and then they'll come onto our communities and say, hey, my Xbox doesn't turn on. What do I do? And then we'll help them and advise them on how to get use out of it and stuff. So yeah, definitely, and I've said this before, I feel like we're currently in sort of the renaissance of the Xbox because there's a ton of projects coming out, a ton of just countless hours of effort that's going into making PCBs and 3D printed parts and new software and stuff like that. Like it's as active now as it's ever been. And, I'd love to have you around a little bit more often. Maybe we can show you a bit more of what this console can do nowadays. And it's been great hearing from you. I thank you a lot for taking the time with us.
Yeah, no problem. This is it's all good fun, and especially the stuff you guys are doing.
I thank you so much, Marco, for coming on. I appreciate your time, and for everyone who's joined us on episode 3 of The Usual Places. With that, we're going to sign out. Thank you so much for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.